Good morning. Like Marin's previous presentation, this study also examines the changing perspectives of ancestry and investigates the oversimplification of race and ancestry concepts within the field of forensic anthropology. The discipline of forensic anthropology has long assessed race or ancestry as part of the biological profile. The historical use and abuse of typological racial categorization have been well documented. While modern practitioners may have shifted terminology from race to ancestry, the degree to which they have changed or critiqued long embedded typological approaches remains unclear. The current study defines race as evolving social, political, and legal categories with roots in European colonial processes that were born out of discriminatory policies. Race has been used historically and currently to classify people based on a variety of physical, cultural, linguistic, and genetic characteristics. While typological races are not valid descriptors of biological variation, they are both socially powerful and potentially biologically impactful. Social race is powerful in that it structures human interactions and negatively affects the biological well being of people who experience racism and stress due to structural inequities perpetuated by a fixed notion of race. Additionally, as a component of self identity, race is regularly argued to be an important aspect of assessment in forensic anthropological casework and research. Ancestry is defined as biogeographically patterned clinal genetic variation that is often continentally derived and defined. The lack of clarity in the shift from race to ancestry is problematic, as it places the onus on the consumers of the literature to deduce what is meant by those terms, and leads to the faulty assumption that all researchers share the same or similar working definitions of race and ancestry. In forensic anthropological practice, the term ancestry has largely replaced the term race to describe a decedent's affinity in a particular population or group, and the terms are often used interchangeably. However, the change in terminology may not be accompanied by concurrent changes in approach or adequate problematizing of the concepts. In essence, the typological concept of race may have been merely replaced by the typological concept of ancestry, with little scrutiny regarding the biological processes underlying this approach. As a historically applied field, forensic anthropological research has focused on individual identification through testing predictive methods. However, this identification-driven goal often obscures the evolutionary and biocultural processes that form the central tenets of research in the broader field of biological anthropology. It seems that forensic anthropologists have dedicated minimal attention to the complex roles played by microevolutionary processes or social structures in creating and maintaining differences among human populations. To investigate the depth of our field's engagement with these concepts, this study initiated a quantitative, systematic analysis of the peer-reviewed forensic anthropology literature on race and ancestry. We sought to explore the terms used by forensic anthropology researchers to describe group affinity and how these terms have changed through the past 5 decades. We hypothesized that an analysis of the peer-reviewed forensic anthropology literature would show that while the term ancestry has replaced the term race, this change in terminology has not been associated with deeper scrutiny or critique of the concepts underlying the terms. Our literature review targeted the 4 peer-reviewed journals most relevant to forensic anthropological practice: AJPA, Forensic Anthropology, Forensic Science International, and JFS, and all the publications that contributed to race and ancestry estimation, totaling 119 articles. Our data indicated that the years 2000 and 2013 represented terminological turning points, with 2000 representing the year in which the term ancestry increased, and 2013 representing the year in which ancestry almost completely replaced race in our field's publications. Thus, these years were used as cutoff points for the early, middle, and modern time periods in this study. For each publication, we noted the publication year, groups studied, terminology used, and whether the authors defined race or ancestry. Lastly, we looked at whether articles discussed the complex processes, colloquially referred to here as the whys, that ultimately underlie regionally patterned human biological variation. These complex whys include population histories, population structures, microevolution, and whether authors critiqued the use of their chosen approaches. Additionally, the incorporation of embodiment theory was also evaluated. This biohistorical approach to race was first introduced to our field by Edgar and Gravely in a 2009 AAPA symposium, and recognized how experiences, identities, and social inequities are skeletally and densely embodied, and that the lived experience of race and racism can impact both social and biological aspects of an individual's life. Our study showed that 96% of the articles written during the early period used the term race to describe human groups, while only 8% used the term ancestry. In the middle period, ancestry was used sporadically and interchangeably with race. The modern period marks when the term ancestry almost completely supplanted race and is currently used in 98% of the surveyed literature. Throughout the three periods, other terms such as population, group, ethnicity, and others were also used sporadically. In contrast to the secular changes in the terms, our field's generally superficial approach to defining these terms has remained relatively constant. Considering the total sample, a mere 13% of articles define the term race, and even fewer define the term ancestry. In comparing the time periods, more authors define the key terms in the middle time period than in time periods that came before and after. Classification terminology was also taken into account across the surveyed publications. These included the typological terms inherited by the early forensic anthropologists and are colloquially referred to here as the oids. In this sample, other schemes for describing human populations included color-based, geography-based, as well as groups described as complex. The exclusive use of the oids was restricted to 3% of the total sample and was evident in the early periods surveyed. However, the oids continued to be used sporadically and in combination with other classification terminology in both of the later periods, persisting until as recently as 2015. The majority of the surveyed articles, 29%, used color-based classification systems. Group terminology, based on geography, was rare in the first 3 decades, with only 8% of the studies describing their populations based on major continental origin. However, this terminology increased to 21% in the middle time period and decreased again to 14% in the modern time period. Population history, structures, and microevolutionary processes were discussed in 59% of the peer-reviewed articles in the total sample and showed an overall increase from the early to modern period. Critiques of race and ancestry has appeared in a quarter of the reviewed articles. Studies that incorporated embodiment theory were scant, totaling just 4% for the overall sample. Our survey of articles has shown that over time, the use of the terms race and ancestry has in essence done a complete about-face, with ancestry almost completely replacing the term race in the literature. The long duration of this transition period is noteworthy. It took nearly 20 years for the disciplinary shift from race to ancestry to take hold. The year 2013 emerged as a cutoff after which race ceased to be used as a valid descriptor of human population affinity, and then only after critique from the broader field of biological anthropology. Both the terms race and ancestry are rarely defined in all three periods. One would expect the shift in terminology would be accompanied by increased definition of these terms. However, the attention to defining these terms has in fact receded in recent years. The lack of clear definitions for race or ancestry reflects the field's overemphasis on methodology and group classification for the purpose of ancestry estimation with the aim of individual identification, rather than critically exploring what practitioners are actually estimating. In the early period, Brace critiqued the use of the oids and argued for a change to terminology based on geography. However, as indicated by the present study, the field of forensic anthropology instead adopted skin color-based terminology. Ancestry groupings based on skin color were used interchangeably with geographic ancestry during the middle and modern periods. Skin color groupings still predominate the field and have continued to be used as recently as last year. The field's engagement with forces patterning human biological variation was more encouraging, with a total of 59% of the articles considering processes like population histories and microevolution. Still, the fact that only 63% of authors from the modern time period discussed evolutionary processes means that over a third of the surveyed articles still do not consider the underlying reasons why populations differ from each other. Further, the amount of attention given to the whys seem to differ depending on the groups under study and their perceived complexity. As defined by Spradley and Stoll, complex populations are those that have 2 or more parental population groups. Indeed, our sample showed that studies of Hispanic populations were more prone to provide some background on population histories and structures. The same analytical depth afforded to complex populations like American Hispanic groups was not extended to groups like African and European Americans. By comparison, scholars studying South African populations have been more willing to recognize the complexities of their own unique African and European descended populations. In future research, American authors should be wise to follow their example, also keeping in mind the heterogeneous and regionally differentiated nature of the African and European American populations. Ambiguous definitions and a lack of in-depth exploration of the forces driving population similarities or differences may be partially rooted in the peer-reviewed journal editorial process. Forensic anthropology authors seemed freer to theorize and push boundaries in the edited volume chapters and special journal issues we surveyed, compared with the more traditional peer-reviewed journal articles. In one example from this present sample, Owsley et al. 2018 dedicated a much deeper, more critical, and more thoroughly theorized review of topics like racism, typology, and embodiment theory in their book chapter compared with their journal article in 2009. Approaches to publishing the why questions differed from journal to journal. The primary producer of ancestry-related papers, the JFS, included papers almost exclusively devoted to methodology, and discussions regarding population histories, population structures, and microevolutionary processes were relatively scant. Conversely, while purely forensic articles were rarer in the AJPA, they more frequently included deeper discussions regarding the biocultural processes that lead to modern human skeletal variation. In conclusion, we systematically reviewed the forensic anthropological literature that has produced the field's key knowledge in race and ancestry estimation practice and identified significant deficiencies. Forensic anthropology scholars almost never discuss the possibility for social inequities to be biologically embodied, rarely defined race and ancestry, critiqued typological approaches only one-third of the time, and contextualized discussions regarding the driving forces of population differences or similarities in less than two-thirds of the articles. Additionally, while we have almost entirely replaced race with ancestry, theoretical acknowledgments of this shift have not accompanied terminological advancements. The lack of definitions for race and ancestry, coupled with the paucity of discussions exploring the bigger picture biocultural processes that contribute to the non-randomness of human skeletal variation, has left our field susceptible to typological assumptions and representations of our research, particularly with the people outside of forensic anthropology. In order for our field to evolve into one that does not actually embrace or appear to embrace typological perspectives, we need to begin by defining what we mean by race and ancestry, or whatever term we use to talk about a collection of people who share bioculturally patterned skeletal and dental similarities. This will likely require both individual and field-wide self-reflection regarding how ancestry estimation contributes to the communities with whom we work to identify and conduct research on. It is really wonderful to see that various scholars in the discipline have been working on these very concepts, as evidenced by the other presentations and posters given during this conference. Additionally, self-reflection will require us to assess who is and is not represented in knowledge production, and why Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color are infrequently involved in studies centered around race and ancestry estimation. Further, by authoring our own definitions, our field can assert its place in important discussions regarding race, ancestry, embodiment, and anti-racism. In this particular moment in history, we must work harder to ensure that forensic anthropology is a nuanced, relevant science that benefits people beyond our field. We would like to thank the following individuals for their help with gathering the articles. For additional questions, please contact me and my co-authors, Drs. Tallman and Winburn. Thank you very much.